Hey everyone, Nick Ravelis here, Director of Education and Community Engagement for San Diego Opera, and I'm here at San Diego Opera's costume shop to talk to you about the opera Cinderella. That's the opera that you're coming to as part of the San Diego Opera student dress rehearsal. Are you ready? Let's go. So, an opera based on the fairy tale Cinderella. You're all probably familiar with the Disney version of the story, or maybe even the recent live-action film version. But basically, we're talking about a young woman who's being raised by her father with a wicked stepmother and two evil stepsisters who've so taken over the family that poor Cinderella has become the family's servant. She's always shown in torn and tattered clothes, usually with a broom in her hand, and she's sweeping up the crumbs after meals. She's even depicted as sitting in front of the fireplace, dreaming about being free, about being someone else, and maybe, just maybe, about marrying a handsome prince and living happily ever after. Well, of course, as the story develops, that's exactly what happens. Her fairy godmother appears to her and makes it possible for her to go to the prince's ball in a beautiful dress and a fancy carriage with liveried servants and 4 white horses. And of course, she's admired by everyone at the ball, especially by the prince, as the most beautiful woman there. But she has to return before the stroke of midnight, right? Otherwise, all the magic will disappear and she'll turn back into the poor servant girl that she is at home. Of course, she's left so quickly that she's left behind a glass slipper. And with that glass slipper, the prince will search all over the land trying to fit every woman in the kingdom to that perfect little shoe. You know what happens at the end, of course. When the prince comes to Cinderella's house, the two wicked stepsisters try desperately to fit their big fat feet into the slipper, but to no avail. The slipper will only fit Cinderella, who's the last person to try it on, and of course, it fits perfectly. The wicked stepmother and the stepsisters are humbled, and Cinderella marries the prince and lives happily ever after. The end. Well, are you aware that there are scores, maybe even hundreds of versions of the same story in basically every culture throughout the world? The version we're most familiar with, and the version that Disney used as the basis of the animated film, is French. It was part of a collection of fairy tales collected by Charles Perrault, and it's one of the more detailed versions of the story, with some charming touches like that glass slipper, the pumpkin that turns into a royal carriage, the lizards that turn into liveried servants. But the Brothers Grimm also had a version of the story in their later collection of fairy tales, and it has some pretty grisly additions, like, for instance, in order to try to make the slipper fit, the evil stepsisters cut off their toes and their heels, so desperate are they to marry the handsome prince. Yuck. But there are versions from China, Spain, Korea, the Philippines, Great Britain, Scotland, and a lot more. The versions all vary from each other, some in tiny little ways. Others are quite different from the story that we know well and that we love. The point of the story is always the same. It's about a woman who is unjustly oppressed, and through her goodness and sometimes a little bit of magic, she overcomes her state in life, triumphant in the end, and comes out on top. Well, there's nothing like becoming a princess to make your family stand up and take notice, right? There are so many different stage versions of Cinderella, plays and musicals, that I can't even begin to list them all. But you might not know that there are at least 2 different opera versions of the story. The best known is the one we'll be producing at San Diego Opera, and it's by the Italian composer Gioacchino Rossini. It was written in the early 1800s and first performed at an opera house in Rome, Italy. Rossini wrote quite a few operas during his career, some of them tragic, some of them comic, like The Barber of Seville. La Cenerentola, or Cinderella, is one of his comedies, but of course, there are some touching moments in the opera as well, especially when Cinderella expresses sadness over her position in the family, or when she feels towards the end of the opera that she may never see the prince again. For the most part, though, it's a charming and often very funny piece of entertainment with some really beautiful music in it. One of the things that you'll notice immediately about the opera is that there's no fairy godmother. That's right, no fairy godmother, but instead a wise older man, a teacher actually, named Alidoro, who comes to Cinderella's house disguised as a beggar, but who is actually a member of the prince's court. Cinderella is so kind to him that he helps her prepare for the prince's ball and acts as a kind of protector for her throughout the evening at the castle. There's also no glass slipper. Now, you may wonder how it's possible to tell the story of Cinderella without the glass slipper, but that's a detail in very few of the many versions of the story, and you'll find that it's just not necessary in order to get the point of the story across. In Rossini's opera, Cinderella leaves behind a bracelet, not a glass slipper. In fact, she shows the prince a pair of matching bracelets, giving one of them to him, and he recognizes her at the house later on when she has the matching bracelet, and indeed she must be the beautiful woman from the ball. The opera was written by Rossini for a theater in Rome, the Teatro Valle, and it had its first performance there in 1817. Seems amazing to us, but it only took about 3 weeks for Rossini to write the opera. He had the help of a poet, his librettist, Jacopo Ferretti, who wrote the story and the words. We call him a librettist because he wrote the libretto for the opera, and libretto means little book. It's the text of the opera, the words. Now, going to the opera in the early 1800s, when Cenerentola was first performed, audiences wanted fantasy. They wanted to be taken away, transported to another place and time. The story of Cinderella gave Rossini and Ferretti the opportunity to show people living in a mansion, for instance, or a prince living in a beautiful castle. To be able to show Cinderella and her stepsisters in a beautiful, glittering gown when they go to the castle for the ball. This was something that really attracted the audiences of the time. But it also seemed to Rossini as a perfect story for an opera because it had interesting characters, a strong and independent heroine, a handsome prince, the prince's butler, Dandini, and those two very funny but evil stepsisters. The opera had plenty for everyone, but especially the music, which we'll talk about now. Our composer Rossini wrote his operas in a style that we call bel canto. It's an Italian phrase which simply means beautiful song. In this musical style, an orchestra provides a simple accompaniment, and the voice part is written in such a way that it's highlighted, underlined, emphasized. None of the instruments in the orchestra get in the way of the beauty of the vocal melody. And those melodies are beautifully written in order to make the most of the voice that's, frankly, singing them. Of course, the words have to come first, and a composer like Rossini would work very closely with the poet, Ferretti in this instance, to come up with the best way of expressing the character's emotions. These words would inspire the composer to set them to music and to find the best way to express emotion through music. We see all this at the beginning of the opera when we're introduced to the three sisters, Clorinda and Thisbe, the stepsisters, and Cinderella herself. Listen to the music that Rossini creates for the two wicked stepsisters, the characters that we meet first. It's dance-like, almost prancing, as the two of them talk about how beautiful they are as they get ready for the day. The music tells us that they're full of themselves, really full of themselves, and completely uninterested in poor Cinderella, who's sitting by the fire waiting for the coffee to boil.
Sì!
Cinderella is in her own little world as all this is going on. She begins to sing, and the music changes character completely. Suddenly it's slow and lyrical, even with the overall feel of a folk song. She sings about a handsome king who's lonely and wants a wife. Who will he choose? Out of all the women who desire to become his queen, he chooses the one who is devoted to him and who is faithful. But it's a sad little song because Cinderella knows that she will never ever be that woman. Notice how simple the orchestra sounds underneath the voice. It provides a pulse, almost like a heartbeat, nothing more. There's no melody in the orchestra, just simple chords. All the melody belongs entirely to the voice of Cinderella. So the music of the bel canto style does what? It captures the feelings of the characters in the story by using beautiful music inspired by poetry, featuring the voice above everything else. Nothing competes for attention from the voice. According to the bel canto composers in Italy in the early 1800s, nothing, absolutely nothing, can interfere with the beauty of the voice. And even if a character in an opera was a villain, or was complicated, or had lots of problems, that character's music would always be, well, beautiful. The other thing that a composer like Rossini had to do was decide what kind of voice a singer would have in order to portray this character on stage. In Cenerentola, he decided that the main character, Cinderella, must be what we call a mezzo-soprano. The mezzo-soprano is a particular kind of female voice with a very special quality. It's a voice that could sound quite dark and kind of mysterious at one point, but also steely and powerful when necessary. This was perfect for the character of Cinderella because in this version of the story, she's really strong, independent, a feisty young woman. So Rossini wanted a voice that could portray all that strength and independence of spirit. Here's a great example. For the prince, Rossini chose the voice type of the tenor. Now, the tenor is a higher male voice. In the time of the composition of this opera, tenors were almost always the heroes of the story because they had heroic-sounding voices. The tenor's voice could sometimes almost sound like a trumpet with clear, penetrating sound. Here's what that voice sounds like.
Si ritrovai un se in gremo la troverò, io la ritroverò, io la ritroverò, 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 la ritroverò.
Now, there are other voice types in this opera. Sopranos, for instance, the higher voice types that portray the two stepsisters. Or the bass, a very low male voice who portrays Cinderella's stepfather, Don Magnifico. When you come to the theater and you hear the different voice types, the different instruments of the orchestra, the different choices that the composer, Rossini, made in order to tell the story, I think you'll agree that opera is a fascinating way to tell a story through music, and that it can be lots of fun to watch. I know I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. I'll see you at the opera.